Hi, good afternoon. I'm Dan Sweet. I'm Director of Public Relations and Communications for HAI. And welcome to HAI's weekly webinar on news for the rotorcraft industry. We're pleased that you took time to join us today. Looks like our attendance is climbing to the point where I think we can go ahead and get started. We're going to continue our theme today, working through the issues that are arising from the COVID-19 pandemic around the world. And we're going to start out by discussing the Federal Aviation Flight Regulations that just got approved yesterday by the FAA, followed by a roundtable discussion on desktop training. And before we get started, I need to activate my screen here. We're going to go through some introductions. There we go. Introduce you to the panelists who are appearing today. First, as always, we'll be joined, I got the name wrong, Jim Viola, HAI President and CEO. We'll be joined by Matt Callan, Director of Regulations and International Affairs. We have two special guests with us today, Terry Palmer, who is the chair of the HAI Training Working Group, and Matt Thurber, Editor-in-Chief of Aviation International News. They're going to join us for a roundtable here very shortly on desktop flight training that's going to be really informative. And they'll be joined by Zac Noble, Deputy Director of Flight Ops and Tech Services for HAI, and Greg Brown, our Manager of Education here at HAI. During the course of the seminar today, the webinar, we do invite you to ask questions. We will answer questions at the end. To submit your questions, on the control panel on the side of your screen, there is a question tab or bar. There should be a down arrow that you can click to open that up and submit your question. We will, unless you specifically tell us not to, we will identify you, who you are and your question as we get to it at the very end. Now, we do have two subjects today, the SFARs and the roundtable, so we will answer all questions at the very end. Okay, Jim Viola, please take it away.
All right, well, thank you all for joining us today as we discuss a topic that's important to the safety of everyone in industry. It's training. I mean, everybody knows training starts from day one. Well, 3 months ago, we would be training in classrooms and or cockpits, maintaining proficiency and learning additional skills. Well, this is no longer yesterday's world. We must now and in the future look for alternative methods of accomplishing everyday tasks. Nothing truly matches the experience of you gain in a classroom with others, where you can have discussions about, what the topic is for that day, or in a cockpit when you're flying with your CFI. But not everyone today has access to that cockpit right now. And those that do know of all the additional work that's required to maintain the cleanliness for the operations with the restrictions we have today. HAI believes that all forms of training, from books to simulators and of course, actual time in the aircraft, is better than not doing anything during these difficult times. We also believe that training, along with the mindset and technology, is a fundamental pillar of safe flight. So using your available downtime right now to learn, to train, and build skills will make you a better pilot. We also know that not everyone has access to an actual aircraft, as I talked about, or a full motion level D simulator. So today we're actually exploring areas and discussing how a desktop simulator and even aviation training devices, ATDs, can help pilots engage their minds that are nautical decision making, and it really does build a base support for your training. Our goal is not to sell you a particular product or system, but we just want to introduce you to different things that are out there and considering every tool that is available during this time. Other convenient tools, of course, are books and manuals. I mean, when was the last time you fully reviewed your aircraft flight manual, or even went back and looked at your country's aviation regulations? If you're like many pilots, you can still pick up an important point or two every time you read through those chapters. But before we get started on that specific stuff, just as Dan had mentioned, we're going to start today with a presentation by Matt Callan, who is our Director of Regulations and International Affairs. Matt is going to discuss the Special Federal Aviation Regulations, known as SFAR 11818, which was just approved yesterday by the FAA, and what this will help pilots and companies do during this difficult period. So over to you, Matt.
Thanks. Hope you can hear me. So can you go to the next slide there, Dan? Thanks. Whoop. Okay, we'll back up one. There we go. So I'm going to take some time today just to brief this on a very high level. I'm not going to get into detail because what I would prefer is that if this is applicable to you, you can go on the rotor.org website. We have a web page there entitled COVID-19. If you drill down in there, you can find all kinds of information. You can find the actual SFAR 118 and some other documentation there that will provide you with information that you need. So today it's going to be just a very brief background on the exempted regulations that the FAA has already provided to the industry, as well as the SFAR, and these are all in mitigation of COVID-19. Next slide, please. So it as no surprise to anybody, the effects of this pandemic have rippled through the entire world, to include the transportation industry. And this pandemic is affecting pilot currency, regulations, medical certification issues. And this is not only just in the US, this is internationally. So ICAO and EASA are also dealing with this in a large part. Next slide, please. So a little bit of background here, and I'm going to reference the COVID-19 webpage probably several times. A little over a month ago, the FAA granted an exemption, several exemptions to the National Air Transportation Association, and I listed the number here. You can find these actual documents on the COVID-19 page. This one here, 18509, was specific to regulations pertaining to certain required crew member emergency procedures during recurrent and upgrade training. And as you can see, those all apply to Part 135 operators. Next slide, please. And exemption number 18510, also on the webpage. This is relief for regulations pertaining to time frames for completing recurrent training, qualifications requirement, and again, these are all Part 135. Next slide, please. And 18515 pertains to Part 61, and these are medical relief from regulation pertaining validity of medical certificates. And you can, if you go to the web page and you click on these links, it will take you to the actual document that you can read the specific details and guidance provided by the FAA. Next slide, please. So this was a separate document, and you can find this on regs.gov. FAA 2020-0312, and this pertains to expired airman medical certificates, and this came out about a month ago. Next slide, please. And this is just more Part 135 regulations that were providing relief. Next slide. So a little bit more background. Back on the 1st of April, a group of general aviation associations, to include HAI, sent a group letter to the FAA requesting that the FAA enact specific exemptions and policy deviations. And you can see a list of 7 different requests that were submitted to the FAA. And I at this point, I have to point out that the FAA has absolutely bent over backwards for the aviation community, and including the helicopter, the rotorcraft community. they have gone above and beyond to bring about these exemptions, relief from COVID-19, and they've done it in a timely manner, because this is very timely, because a lot of our operators are being impacted by the end of the month. Here we are at the end of April. Next slide, please. So shortly after that, these associations began weekly meetings, teleconferences with the FAA, and communicating these concerns to the FAA, and the FAA took great strides in putting together this document, the Special Federal Aviation Regulation, and it was designated 118, and it went through, I won't go through the details, but it was almost congressional effort on this. It had to go through DOT and rulemaking and legal, and all the way to OMB and the White House before it was approved, and it was signed by the administrator yesterday. And we have a copy of this document on our website that you can access, and you can read the details on this. So next slide, please. So I'm going to give you just a real high level overview of what is included, the actual regulations that the FAA has provided relief. So you can see there everything from parts 21 through 141 are covered, and it provides regulatory relief to persons who have been unable to comply with certain training, recency, testing, checking requirements, and this includes maintenance as well. Next slide. So you can see there's a lot of having to do with Part 61. Some of our members conveyed their concerns specific to Part 61 regulations. So you can see that these have all been documented. And so again, I'd like you to go into the actual document and find, because there are still requirements in order to qualify for this relief. The operators still have to comply with certain requirements. And you can see Part 61, 55, 56, 57, and 58. Next slide. It also, the SFAR also touches upon Part 107, our UAS operators. You can see 107.65. Part 125 really doesn't apply that much to helicopters, but the existing SFAR 73, Robinson helicopters, R-22s, R-44s, there is a relief in the document for those. So you want to pay close attention to that if you operate a Robinson. Next slide. And there's also duration and renewal requirements for medical certificates, practical tests, and you can see that it also touches upon Part 141 pilot school certificates. Next slide. Okay, and with that, we'll have some questions at the end. Thanks.
Thank you, Matt. I appreciate that. I know that just came out yesterday, and so I know that our staff is still looking through that. It's going to take a little bit of time to go through all 94 pages of the SFAR, but that certainly helps us out quite a bit. I'd now like to invite Matt and Terry, Zach and Greg to join us for the roundtable, and that's going to get started with a talk by Matt Thurber on his recent experience with remote coaching. So we'll get started with Matt's first slide.
Thank you, Dan, and I appreciate the invitation to join you all. I'm working on a story right now about using desktop simulation to maintain proficiency during the pandemic. And in my research, I was talking to Keith Smith at Pilot Edge, and also a friend of mine who works as a VATSIM controller. And these are online networks where you can fly your simulator and be speaking with a live person who is basically being a real-time air traffic controller. So it adds a huge amount of realism to desktop simulation. And it's not just making it more realistic, but I'll admit I still have a little bit of nervousness when I'm about to go somewhere IFR and talk to controllers and have to get Class B clearances and everything in real life. And it's exactly the same on the simulator when I'm hooked up to a live air traffic controller. So to extend this a little further, Pilot Edge has a new service called coaching, where flight instructors who just happen also to be Pilot Edge controllers on the side and real live airline pilots and CFIIs offer remote flight instruction over the internet. So you can see from this picture, I'm shooting the GPS runway 30 approach into Long Beach. And this was yesterday, as a matter of fact. And it turned out we used the actual weather because it was pretty crappy for a change in Southern California. I've got my iPad there using ForeFlight, and X-Plane is the simulator I'm using. I've got my headset on with a microphone so I can speak both with the Pilot Edge air traffic controller, but also with my remote coach. In this case, it was Scott Medeiros. So Scott is basically acting like my flight instructor. I'm talking to the air traffic controllers, and I did do all the radio work. And Scott had me do one of his killer scenarios, which is flying from Riverside, California to Long Beach, but shooting a VOR approach at Corona, a GPS approach at Fullerton, then a GPS approach at Long Beach. We didn't have time for some of the other stuff he likes to do, but it still worked out great. So I found the flight was super realistic. It had all the pressure of flying in Southern California airspace, and it I learned a lot working with Scott too, because he treated it like a real lesson. We had ground school for about half an hour before to discuss all the approaches we were going to do, some of the procedures like the departure procedure from Riverside, certain features of the avionics. This is a G1000 Cessna 172. And then we flew the flight and did a good debrief afterwards. So today I flew with another Pilot Edge coach, and Ray had me do a VFR flight from LAX to San Diego Lindbergh Field. And the purpose of this was Class B airspace workout. And again, in the ground school, I learned a lot. There's some unique features of the San Diego Class B airspace that I hadn't used before. And the flight went really well. Flew down there VFR at 3,500 feet, and Ray coached me the whole time. We did good ground school beforehand and a good debrief afterwards, and it was good training. So it occurred to me to wonder if this might be helpful for helicopter pilots. And the only drawback to doing this is that you can't get any FAA credit for any approaches or any flight time, nothing like that. And in fact, for my article, I did ask the FAA, well, why not give credit for instrument approaches on this setup? It is super realistic, and it's a lot better, I think, than just being in an airplane. In an approved simulator without air traffic control hooked up. Now, Pilot Edge does work with a lot of simulators, so if you do have an approved training device, you can hook up Pilot Edge to it, and I highly recommend that. But for helicopter pilots, the one big problem is that while there are some excellent helicopter models available, especially for X-plane, you really need helicopter controls to make it realistic. So, Dan, do you want to switch to the next slide? This slide lists some of the options for training, the simulators, the air traffic control networks, and there is a company that makes helicopter flight simulator controls linked at the bottom. Costs about $1,300, but it's got the pedals, the collective, and the cyclic, and you can hook up your own monitors and use. It works with Microsoft Flight Simulator, Prepared 3D, or X-plane, and other software. So that's one option. I did find one other option, and some of you might have seen this company at Heli Expo. It's called Heli Mod. It's an Australian company, and they not only make a setup with the proper controls, but they also hook it up with a virtual reality helmet. So they can use that for long lining because you can look down and see your load out the side of the window, which is hard to do in most simulators. That's definitely an advantage with virtual reality. So I just thought it'd be a good subject to bring up to discuss the proficiency benefits of desktop simulators, and especially the opportunity with a good helicopter simulator model and the proper controls for helicopter pilots to spend some time flying VFR into IMC or flying IFR, hooking up with a controller network and getting some realistic experience instead of flying under the hood. Under the hood has some value, but I don't think it's as realistic as being even in simulated weather.
Okay, Matt, thanks. I am going to advance to your next slide. It did show some of the software helicopters, or the available helicopters in the software that you were just discussing. And so that can certainly be an option for people who are interested. And I will tell the viewers, you can either use your phone to grab a screen capture, or you will receive a video of this after the webinar is over. Everybody will receive a link to it, and so you will be able to track back to those. Okay, I do invite, let's see, Terry, would you like to go next, please?
Yes. Well, I think what Matt said is awesome. Using something at home to do some of your basic skills helps keep your motor skills up, keeps your brain processing, keeps you in the game. And it also is really good for avionics if you have that package to go with it. Like he had the Garmin 1000, you can get various different packages like that. It's always helpful to work with the avionics. But I'd like to give everybody a little bit of history on what the simulators have done in the helicopter world in the last 15 years. 15 years ago, there were only a handful of civilian helicopter simulators, so there was limited use, mostly offshore, and a handful of other operators. It was only the big aircraft It was the Sikorskys, it was the large twin engine Bells, and some of the ones that, some of the aircraft that require type ratings. So in the last 15 years, we've actually gotten to the point where OEMs have simulators in the US, in Europe, in Australia. Many of the operators have contracted, leased, or purchased simulators offshore. The air medical, tour operators, and of course, flight schools are also using them. And some even allow third-party use. So there's a lot of training going on in simulators. The types of simulators are also different on the helicopter side, because the helicopters, because there's no such thing as a normal helicopter operation, there's no such thing as a normal training situation. So there's a whole variety of simulators that are available. And I mean, you can have the level D, which are mostly used for the larger ones or for any aircraft that requires a type rating. There's flight training devices from level, figure levels 5, 6, 7. Those provide some training credit and do most of the things that the level D does, but without the motion. And then you have the AATDs, and that's what we're going to talk about mostly, because AATDs are these are devices that don't get training credit, but are still extremely valuable. There's minimal training credit available with an AATD, but you can also pick up an AATD and move it from location to location without calling in the FAA to recertify it. So that helps too. So what we're doing here with a desktop simulator is similar to what we're doing with an AATD, okay? But we are actually focusing, when you have an AATD, you're focusing on an aircraft specific. So usually if you're going to buy or lease or use an AATD, it's going to be matching the type of aircraft that you have. That's great for emergency procedures, anything that requires, you know, learning the aircraft itself, start procedures, running checklists, things like that. That's where an AATD is extremely helpful. Now, VRs, like Matt was talking about, the virtual reality, that's just coming out. And I really think it's going to have quite a future, because you do get a more visual approach. However, the FAA hasn't looked at any training credit for that yet. But I want to discuss a little bit about the training credit and why what Matt's doing was so important. Because it's not all about, is the FAA going to allow me to check a box for training credit? It's about, how do I feel confident? Am I safe? Do I feel like I can actually do the flight? This is more important than the training credit. Am I proficient? And proficiency comes from practice in all sorts of ways. And so what Matt's doing is extremely helpful. If we had desktop simulation at home that we could use if we can't fly. There are operations that are flying, and that's awesome, but there's a lot of operations right now that can't fly. And if these pilots, I talked to a pilot the other day, a young woman who was applying for a scholarship, called me about some mentoring opportunities. And, you know, she said, I'm sitting home, I'm working on my MBA, and I'm also on a desktop simulator practicing instrument approaches. And it wasn't a helicopter simulator. Does it have to be a helicopter simulator to practice an instrument approach? No. You're going to learn, you know, practicing the approaches, keeping your head in the game. That's the important thing. I'd also like to talk about a little bit about what the HAI training working group is actually working on right now. We're working on the problem of inadvertent IMC and how do we train for it. So part of it is keeping your head in the game, as we're talking about with the desktop simulators. And part of it is just understanding the decision-making process and learning all that. So the training working group is actually developing a new industry best practice for what is VFR And how do we maintain VFR? If we do our pre-flight and we look and we realize, hey, you know what? I'm not exactly sure that I'm going to be able to maintain VFR for the entire flight. Then we need to have a plan in place to transition into IFR. And so that's what the practice is all about. So we are developing that industry best practice, and then we are developing a series of courses. The first one will be a webinar type course, which HAI will have. And the second one will be a webinar type course followed by simulator scenarios, something you can take to your simulator provider, do in-house, something along those lines. Then the third one will be, and that will have scenarios, you know, so that you have scenarios to do that. The next one will be the same thing, but in an aircraft. There's not a simulator for every aircraft out there, and not every operator uses simulators. Not every pilot uses simulators. So there's going to be a series of things that you can do in the aircraft to practice for that transition to IFR, to understand what the decision-making process is. And it will use either some sort of view limiting device, and there's new view limiting devices that are all electronic, which are phenomenal. And they actually give you the actual feeling of being in the aircraft because you're in the aircraft. So those things are out there as well. So we're going to develop that. So it's going to be those three: a webinar, and a course that includes a simulator scenarios, a course that includes aircraft scenarios, and the fourth one is the course that we give to the customer, the course that we give to the executive, to the celebrity, to the people that are renting the aircraft with a pilot, a course that will actually show them what the importance of pilot decision making is, what the importance of making good decisions based on weather are all about. So those are the things that we're working on the training working group. And I think it's extremely important because what we're doing is going to bring us back to a much safer industry.
I thank you, Terry. That was incredible. I think the online or the information that's coming up through the training committee, training working group, is going to be fantastic. Greg and Zach and Matt, I now invite you to bring your cameras and microphones back on and see if you had any thoughts that we'd like to discuss during the course of the rest of the roundtable.
So one thing I did want to bring up is that in my my request to the FAA for information, I specifically asked the question, well, if a desktop simulator doesn't meet the standards of an aviation training device, which is approved for some credit for instrument approaches, for example, why not get creative and look at using the performance of the flight? Because you can record the whole thing and evaluate the performance, and you look at the performance and say, hey, yeah, boy, these approaches were great. They're really good, you know, stable, right on target, et cetera, et cetera. You could measure the performance of the flight and use that, I think, to give some kind of credit. But in any case, Terry's exactly right that this is more about proficiency and repetitions. And you know, I can't get enough of flying this simulator because I find it's really helpful to keep me keep my hand in the game while I can't fly a real airplane as much.
Zach, any thoughts?
Hey, Dan. Yeah, thanks. I think Matt and Terry brought a lot to the table there. I think it's important, though, and Terry and both stole my line. I was going to say, keep your head in the game. I think there are some things that people can do. I don't know how often folks are flying, and really the audience that is on the webinar here with us today. But there are a lot of things that you can do, to include going out to a local airport and doing some local flying whether that's in an airplane or in a helicopter. Perhaps your parent company can work out a deal to get enough flying going at the local community level to maintain some level of proficiency or at least currency. Also, what I'd like to say is this is a great opportunity in time to kind of get back into the books, look through the instrument flying handbook and the aviation handbook, get into the aeronautical information manual. I recently got my personal copy of the Faa Safety Briefing here. The whole magazine is dedicated to aviation communication, and I just had to chuckle a bit when I read through it because there's so many things that I said, wow, I used to do that, or I still do that, and I need to clean that action up. But I think there's a lot of desktop flying, things that we can do to, as Terry and Matt said, keep our head in the game so that when we do get back to the flying piece, it's not totally foreign. There were many times when I would go out to the hangar and just sit in the aircraft and run through checklists, flip switches, get on a portable power unit and work through the avionics, because, wiggling the stick or flying the airplane or helicopter, for most of us really isn't the challenge. After you've been doing it for a number of years, flying the machine really isn't the problem. The challenge that we get into is getting back into that flow, getting back into the checklist, and then keeping your head into the procedures of what's going to happen next. Most of aviation is being able to anticipate, what's going to happen 2 or 3 or 5 or 15 minutes from now. So I think that's really the challenge, and I think that's what we're looking for. So whether it's simulation to help you keep your head in the game, or just doing some sitting down with some approach plates and the aim and going over the proper procedures. Maybe it's now that you learn, you go back and say, hey, wow, I've been doing that kind of run for a while and I can clean that up now. It happens to me all the time, so what I've discovered recently too is almost everything is online, whether it's you can get the manuals for the Garmin, all the Garmin products and the Aspen products and the Genesis products. It's all out there. So if you didn't have the time before to really dwell into the manuals, now might be your opportunity to get into a manual and figure out some of the hows and how-tos on some of that stuff.
Okay, thanks, Zach. Greg, did you have any thoughts? I know you're going to talk in just a second about the online academy, but any thoughts related to the desktop flying?
Absolutely. One of the things for me was while I was instrument rated, I wasn't instrument current. And I went back prior to the pandemic and started working on my instrument proficiency check. And it was an eye-opening experience, because with the many hours I have in instrument flying, but have not flown in a few years, to get back to instrument scan, understand all the intricacies of flying in the airspace, really woke me up. And Zach and everybody so eloquently mentioned, get back in the books and really jump in the books to get your head back in the game. And I really do believe that a desktop simulator can help you do that. You can sit down, you can fly the approach, you can see what happens. You can do a lot of things on the desktop simulator that can help you get back proficient in instrument flying, because when you lose it, it takes a little bit to get it back and become proficient again. Just because you're rated doesn't mean you're proficient, and you've got to understand that. So you got to get back in the books, get on the instrument desktop simulator and fly it, and that through is really important.
Okay, thanks, Greg. Okay, we're going to get to the questions in just a second. I'm going to turn my monitor back on and hopefully bring the correct screen up so that everybody will be able to see. Can we see the courses that are available for the online academy?
So,
is that what everybody sees?
As you can see, the online academy, we're working really hard to build a robust system that brings a lot of courses out. What we have currently, starting with we have partnered with the Unmanned Safety Institute, offer a series of UAS courses We have the UAS 101 to Part 107 course, and UAS Safety Observer, and there are quite a few others that are online. Go ahead and check it out. But, during this time is a perfect opportunity. If you're thinking about getting your Part 107 license, go online and look at some of the courses we have that can help you get your Part 107 license. We also have a team with business training experts and looking at a collection of management courses. If you've got some folks working for your organization who need some management training, go ahead and take a look and see some of the courses that we have. It talks about communication, talks about building leadership skills, a lot of things that are online that can help us, help you as an organization and your folks as you work online and you're at home to get some training done. We also have kind of introductory safety, maintenance, and operations management courses. And if someone's just been selected to become a safety manager, operations manager, or maintenance manager, these courses kind of give them fundamentals of what they need to learn, become, and operate in those environments. As mentioned before, you've got the Garmin, and we've got a Garmin 435/30 course, and also ForeFlight courses, because it's prevalent now in the industry. Everyone knows about ForeFlight, Pfizer ForeFlight, or has a Garmin 435/30 in some way, shape, or form. So we have courses that can really outline a lot of things you can work on in that area. So go ahead, again, go online, look at all those courses. Currently, what we have is for HAI members, for all the paid courses, we're offering 20% off until the end of May. So this is a great opportunity. Go ahead online and get some courses. If you've attended Rotor Safety, Heli Expo, excuse me, and one of the Rotor Safety Challenge presentations, and you really want to go back and take a look at the one that you really liked, for our HI members, they're free online currently. You can go on and view all those courses from the 2020 Heli Expo. For the members out there who were not able to make it to Heli Expo, again, here's your opportunity to go online and view some of those presentations that we have and get up to speed. Again, this is a perfect opportunity. Get yourself some training and go online and take a look at that. So if you have any questions about the education, please don't hesitate to contact me or let me know. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Greg. Hey, we do have a few questions. We do have one for Matt Callan. We'll get him back online in a second. So I'll start with one for, oh, there he is. Look at that right there. Matt, do I have to proactively apply for these relief measures in the SFAR, or is this a blanket measure that automatically applies?
No, it's not a blanket measure. And if you look at the actual document and read, so say, for example, part 61.57, you would want to go and find that particular regulation. It'll tell you, for example, you might have a 3-month extension. I'm not looking at the document right now, but I'm just giving an example. There are certain requirements that the operator has to comply with in order to be able to use that particular regulation for relief. So again, I'd like you to go in and actually look at the document, and you should be able to get that. Is that online yet, Dan? Have we been able to post that on the website?
I know the draft document that the FAA submitted to the Federal Register is online. It was available through Rotor Daily, and it should be available through rotor.com. So yes, I believe so.
Okay, good. Yeah, you alluded to the fact that document, I think, is 91 pages long. So there is a lot of detail, but it's easy to understand. So if the person that asked the question, or if they just go open up the document, look and find that particular regulation that applies to them, that will give them the answer there. But no, it's not just a blanket approval. I hope that answers.
Thank you, Matt. This next one, is there a company that makes helicopter simulator controls? I know it was on one of the slides, but it might have been hidden a little bit.
Yeah, there was that one that's on the slide there. The other one that I mentioned the actual product name is Heli Mod, but it's a company named Ryan Aerospace. And they're in
Okay.
um,
And then I saw one, I believe it's the same brand that we have at our flight simulator, flight training aid here at HAI, is made by Puma. And so there are a couple of different helicopter flight control devices that are out there, certainly different price points. I don't know what the range is on the one Matt was just talking about, but it looked like the one for Puma, I think I saw ranges from 1,200 and up on that.
I think it would make it a lot more realistic. I have a nice yoke type control for my simulator, and it works really well. It's got a good electric trim system that makes the trimming a lot more natural. And I found that makes a huge difference when you're hand flying.
Okay. And I guess Matt Thurber, this one's for you also. Can you give a range of pricing for the Pilot Edge services?
Sure, it's basically $20 a month, and I believe that covers whatever you do during that month. So it's fairly reasonable. It's pretty easy to set up. You have to install a program on your computer, and then when you're ready to fly, you just have to connect your simulator to Pilot Edge, and you can do it two ways. You can just connect to Pilot Edge, and if you're flying at a non-tower airport, just go ahead and taxi and call the CTAF frequency and let other virtual pilots know what you're doing. And then once you get in the air, you could call the local approach control for flight following. You could fly to a Class D airport, contact the tower outside the Class D. You could fly to a Class B airport and talk to approach for a Class B clearance. The other way is if you're going IFR, you have to file a flight plan to fly IFR normally. So in this case, you file the flight plan on Pilot Edge's system instead of with the FAA. So it's fairly simple. You file a flight plan, then you call, just as you would in a real aircraft, you call clearance delivery if applicable, or ground control. You get your clearance, and you got to write it down, read it back, call for taxi clearance, takeoff, etc. Just like the real thing.
Okay, thanks, Matt. I think this next one's for Greg. Greg, I know you were just looking for instructors for next year's Heli Expo in New Orleans. What sort of courses are at Heli Expo are related to simulation?
Some of the courses that we have specifically in the Road to Safety Challenge portion, we talk about how simulation can help in the training aspects, and how using a simulator is a cost-effective way if some of the training that they need prior to going into the airplane. So I think at the last Heli Expo, we had 2 presentations that dealt with the simulation aspect of it. And I know Terry's very experienced in that area as well. She's used a lot and taught a lot in simulators, and has given a presentation, I know, about simulators and the effects that they have. So mostly in the Road to Safety Challenge aspect of Heli Expo.
Okay. Let's see here. There's for Matt Thurber, can you repeat the name of the flight instructor you mentioned during your discussion?
So the one I worked with yesterday was Scott Medeiros. And hang on a second, I'll double check. Today's was just a second. Ray Salmon, and they're both airline pilots, CFIIs, and pilot edge controllers as well. So they know really how the system works. But just as an aside, I did ask Pilot Edge if they could do coaching with helicopter pilots, and it would just be a matter of if the customer has the right simulator setup to fly a helicopter, and they could find some experienced helicopter coaches to fly with you.
Okay, great idea. We don't have any other questions, but we do have several attendees who submitted information on how they maintain proficiency through simulation. HAI, of course, recommends that you do as much research as you can online to see what works for you and your budget. This one comes from a Spencer Power. For operators needing aircraft-specific recurrency, Flight Safety is now offering live learning ground school based on aircraft models flown, allowing for sim time to be accomplished within a 90-day window and the completion of the ground school portion. This delivery method is FAA and EASA approved. Additionally, we have the helicopter instrument refresher being offered via live learning with the same 90-day window to accomplish. Then Richard Gallagher offered a bunch of solutions for flight training simulation. X-Plane with Bell 407 or R22 and a Puma Pro Flight Simulator controller with VR virtual reality is best for helicopters. He also adds, don't forget, ForeFlight works with X-Plane, even gives runway warnings. ForeFlight can record your flight and is available for review. I was away from helicopters for almost 20 years. I was able to pass a flight review with autos after flying an X-Plane using virtual reality and proper helicopter controls. Garmin has 3 simulators for their products. And finally, he adds, I found real safety issues with real approaches using my desktop simulator. So that is something to be aware of. Certainly appreciate everybody's time this afternoon. I think that's going to wrap up our roundtable and our questions. Just to finish wrapping up today, get down to my final screen here. There will be a follow-up questionnaire coming to you this afternoon. We do appreciate your time and your thought in putting answers down for that. The best way that we know how to respond to what you want to learn or what you need to know more information about is through this survey. Additionally, probably tomorrow morning, you will also receive a link to the video of today's presentation. We simply don't have it takes a little time for it to render the video and get that out. Otherwise, we'd have that to you later today. Save the date, HAI at Work webinar next week, trends in aviation insurance. We know that there's been a number of questions regarding policies, licenses, a number of different topics regarding insurance. So we are bringing in Jim Gardner, who is president of the board of directors for the Aviation Insurance Association. He'll be with us next week at 4 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time. If you do have other COVID-19 impact stories, we are still looking for those. Cade Clark and the Government Advocacy Office really uses that information to help develop the request to the government for more funding. If we can tell the government that our industry is really suffering and we have the numbers to back it up, the stories to back it up, it carries that much more weight up on the hill. And finally, as always, if you have any thoughts, things you'd like to develop with us, any interests, any complaints about HAI, please use president@rotor.org with your questions, your challenges, your statements, your appreciation. Until next week, stay safe, fly safe, and we'll see you then.